How quickly can you check in with people when there's a problem? St- Terrible storm hits, want to make sure everyone's all right. Well, the speed really depends upon the format or the medium that you have available to you. If you have to wait till you can find someone in person, it's going to take a while to check in. Phone calls, a bit faster. Email can be even faster. Fastest way seems to though to check in with people seems to be online resources, Facebook, etc. Other online platforms. That's where we can find out what's happening. If you rewind the clock before Facebook, before telephone, before electricity, if you go all the way back to the times of Scripture, the most cutting edge technology, the quickest way to check in with somebody was the letter, using the comparatively new establishment of the Roman roads that allowed for the delivery of mail to be happen in a much more dependable and fast way. Like that's pretty good. And so that's what we're looking at. Last week we looked at the end of Revelation and why it is so important to be reading it today. It's the source of hope. This morning we go to the beginning. We're going to start at the beginning of the book and we'll work our way back through it, get back to the end. And we're reading this, and what we're reading, we need to remember, is a letter from John on the island of Patmos, sent to the 7 churches that he has heard about are having a rough go. And so he writes this letter. We are reading, there are 7 letters. We're going to, if you want to start reading from the beginning of Revelation, you'll get through all of them. We know that they're all in one area of the Roman Empire, and we know that if John wants to communicate with these 7 churches, he could have written 7 copies of this. But man, that's just a lot of writing, because he would have had to hand copy it. And there's no guarantee every copy would have gotten there. And frankly, this is just kind of what made sense. So he writes this letter, and what he does is he writes a portion to this church, a portion to this church, a portion to this church, and he puts them all together in one document, and he sends it off. And when it gets to the first church, they'll read it and worship to everyone, and then they'll pick someone amongst them, and they'll send it on to the next church. So it's kind of a circular letter. These are the 7 churches of Asia Minor, and remembering that Revelation does have a thing for numbers. The number 7 might be some sort of way of getting at 7 complete, that these are sent to the wholeness, the completeness of the church. It could be that there's just 7 churches. This very well could just be that's how many churches were planted and lasted in that area. So we begin with this letter today, and as we begin reading it, we read it with the same sense of expectation that they would have had back then, that John tells them that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Like there's something happening here, that this is a message that he has to pass on to these churches, being given by their Lord, by Jesus. Big deal. And so what Jesus has to say for these 7 churches, that there's a pattern. To each church is said some sort of praise, and then a concern, and I have this against you, and then a promise, but this will happen. So there's however church is addressed. Praise, I have this against you, then a promise. And so the praises are things like, I know your endurance, I know your faith, I know one church has kept my word, right? And then the I have against you, the concerns. One church, you've abandoned your first love, you have tolerated Jezebel, you have fallen asleep, you are lukewarm. And then the promises that are given to the churches, that they will eat of the tree of life, that they will have the white robes, that there'll be a place on my throne for you. Right? So these are the ways the letters to the churches are written. Now, if you imagine that moment of reading this for the first time, people gathered together, it'd be more of a house church, it wouldn't be anything this formal, this elaborate, right? And so you have a gathering of people in a house, in someone's home, and they have a letter from John, and these people are excited. They have a letter from John. They're going to read what he has to say, and they get to the point where they read that, and a letter to the church, and oh, that's our church. What's he have to say? I can imagine it being a bit awkward to hear the praise. I hear of your endurance. I have heard of your faith. I've heard you kept my word. Like, that'd be great. But then to hear, I have this against you, that would be an odd moment. Sort of a public statement, a clear statement, like a public statement of this is the problem we have in this church. That would have been kind of weird to experience. To tell a group that's in the middle of being persecuted, because that's what's happening here. These letters are written to these churches because the churches in general are being persecuted by the Emperor Domitian in the 90s AD. To tell them that it is time for them to double down on their faith, to get themselves in order because they have abandoned their first love, or they've fallen asleep, or they've become lukewarm. I could see some people react to this by muttering, John, you might want to wait a minute. You don't seem to understand what type of flack we're catching here. All right, this is probably especially true of the church at Sardis, the one called dead, and the church at Laodicea, which is not praised at all and is called lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, so I spit you out, is the comment made. And I could imagine the people receiving these letters pondering, how dare anyone criticize them when they're having a rough time because of their faith. It seems even a bit more out of place when we know that what happens next in the letter, the apocalypse of John, Revelation as we call it, is that we have the 7 bowls and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Like, we've got a lot coming, lots of very interesting things. But how does it begin with these seven disciplinary letters? In the context of this persecution, what any church is called to do, especially these 7 churches, is to be committed to following Jesus. This is Jesus who's telling them to shape up and to double down on their faith in him, to do what he did, right? This is what he is telling the church, to not lash out, don't try to hurt others in return, don't blame others, don't make it about them, just keep on being like me, Jesus, your Lord. It's not a given that these churches are going to do this either. Like, to think that it's obvious to them, I think that's assuming too much, right? They're in the 90s AD. That's 60 years past the first Easter. Things are still kind of rocky, haven't really settled down much. They could have easily been tempted to lash out at others or to walk away. There are plenty of other options in the town square of people who would seek and desire their worship, their membership, right? Their commitment to another deity, another thing claiming to be God. And this is a critical moment for the church. Like, how will they respond under pressure? Like, down the road over the centuries, the church has learned to respond under pressure by recommitting to being Christ-like. But this is 94 AD. This is where that learning is beginning, right? And this is the second real persecution of the church. When Nero had persecuted the church earlier, Nero was crazy. Like, Nero had burned down the center of Rome to make room for a new palace and a 50-foot statue of himself that was clad in gold. Like, Nero is wackadoodle, right? And so his persecution had not been systematic. It had just been kind of a madman on a rampage. This is different, right? This is Domitian persecuting the Christians, and this is a systematic sort of, the government has decided that Christians should not be allowed, and it's far worse, right? And so it's easy to turn the other cheek, less challenging. No, it's never easy, but it's less challenging to turn the other cheek in the face of a madman who burns bright, so to speak, and then dies and is gone. And like, that is tragic, but doesn't feel like an existential threat. in the same way that Domitian was turning the full force and power of the Roman Empire against the Christians. And so these churches, these 7 churches, and many more churches were having to decide, are we going to, because we're following Jesus, we're catching flack, are we going to recommit ourselves? Or are we going to sort of stay where we're at and risk being lukewarm, and in being lukewarm fade away into nothing? And so these letters that show up, the 7 letters to the 7 churches, bidding them to recommit and to be more of what got them in trouble in the first place. Like this is an important inflection point, an important decision. This decision shapes the very nature and the spirit of the church, and that this is the case is actually reflected in the way the letters are written. The letters are not written to the church at Laodicea, right? It's written to the angel of the church. And that's an interesting nuance. I think it's an essential one, because every church has its own sort of spirit, has its own sort of sense of self. And it's not like you're not writing to the board meeting, you're not writing to the trustees, you're not writing to any other group in the church, you're writing to the whole church. And what is the spirit of the church? What is the angel of the church? What is the sense of the church about itself? And the risk is that the angel of the church, the spirit of the church, if it turns away from Jesus, that what's an angel that falls? Right? That's the risk here. And so the church faces this decision. These churches face these decisions, how to respond to persecution. And this is a question that gets to the core of their faith. Right? When push comes to shove, it's important to recommit to following Jesus. And Jesus makes this commitment to them that if they stay committed to him, that Romans 3:20, listen, I'm standing at the door knocking. If you hear my voice, open the door. I will come in to you and eat with you and you with me. Right? This is the way that as they commit themselves to following him, that he is going to be knocking on their door. And by committing themselves to following him, this is how they'll be listening for when he comes knocking. If there's a famous painting of Jesus knocking at the door, it's sort of a side shot, Jesus knocking at the door. And it's always interesting to note as you look at this painting that Jesus knocking on the door, and there's no exterior doorknob. This door can only be opened from the inside. And this is inspired by this moment in Revelation that Jesus is writing to these 7 churches through John, that you're being persecuted, and I support you. You have to support me. You have to recommit to me. And if you are, when I come knocking, you will hear me, and I will come in. And so if there are any problems that are going to keep people from hearing Jesus knocking, that this is what they need to address now as churches, that they not lash out under persecution, they not fade away, but they recommit. So what are the problems that might prevent them from hearing when Jesus knocks? Problems such as arose the 7 churches are encountering, that we read in these letters that they're abandoning their first love, that they need to get back to their initial enthusiasm, need to rekindle the passion, the drive of the first days of following Jesus, that they need to hold on to the teachings of Jesus because they're being distracted by other teachings. In that day, it was the teachings of a group called the Nicolaitans that was tempting. Today, the temptation is to get away from the teaching of Jesus and lapse into something like what we might call the prosperity gospel, which is that Jesus is just going to make everything all right. We just have to pray about it and it'll be made perfect, right? And that's not how it works, but that's not what's in Scripture. But the prosperity gospel, just pray it away, it'll be great, right? Or there are temptations right now, nationalistic temptations. Something called Christian nationalism is becoming far more popular, that sort of weaves together the love of state and the love of Jesus into the same thing, and it's not the same thing. You can love your country, you can love the Lord your God, but those are 2 different loves. And the warning to the letters, the churches in Revelation, one of them is, do not be distracted by teachings other than scriptural. To love Jesus is the eternal commitment we make to the salvation of all that Jesus is working with the salvation of all humanity for the good of the entire people, for God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven, and that the love country is a different thing. It is not an eternal thing. It is a temporal thing. It is good for now, but it is different than the eternal commitments we make. What is leading the churches astray, abandoning their first love, other teachings other than scriptural, being asleep and dead and inert is one of the churches, that they're being lukewarm. This is one that always caught my attention. Why is Laodicea accused of being lukewarm? You see, Laodicea is a community where this church is, where they pipe in their water from out of town, and by the time the water is piped in at the great distance, it's neither the cold water of a spring, nor is it the hot water of something that's been sort of heated up. It's lukewarm. It's just room temperature. And so it is supremely unrefreshing. And so in Laodicea, it's kind of a deep cut if you don't understand what that community, but to be lukewarm is just to blend in, right? And in Laodicea, when it's so frustrating that they just end up drinking a lot of lukewarm water, that would get to them. The promise of these letters is that the persecution will end at some point, that Domitian, the emperor of the Roman Empire, will fall, a new day will dawn. The promise, though, is not that they're going to somehow change this persecution. In the entire book of Revelation, it's God who ends persecutions, who stops wars from happening. There is no final battle in Revelation. There's no Armageddon. God stops it from happening. So this is not a promise that if they just believe hard enough, everything is going to turn into sunshine and roses by the afternoon. Like, that's not what these letters to the churches are telling them. It's not just believe a little bit harder, it'll all be made perfect. There's a lady by the name of Brene Brown who captures this. She did a TED Talk talking about her return to church. And she's an academic. She studies the psychology of grief and shame. And she just does some fascinating work. But she did a TED Talk and then a later video that talks about how when she came back to church, wanting it to be an epidural, wanting for it to make all the pain to go away. An epidural is a needle inserted in the lower back of a woman during childbirth, and it makes all the sensation from wherever that needle is inserted, and then a drug is used. All that sensation from the lower part of the body just goes away, and that's what she was looking for. She was looking for an epidural, and instead, what she found the church to be was a midwife saying, "It's going to hurt. And it's worth it, and you'll get through it." And that's kind of what these letters are from John to the seven churches of Asia Minor. It's not an epidural saying, if you just pray a little bit more, all the pain will go away. It's a midwife. These letters are like a midwife saying, it's worth it. It's going to hurt some. In the end, your faith is going to be rewarded, and in the end, the persecution is going to pass. But you're just going to get through it. And you get through it by recommitting to following the Lord who you committed to follow in the first place. If they can hold on thus, they know that they're being reassured that they can survive and they can thrive. They double down on their faith. They do not stray. They keep following Jesus. They don't lash out in a non-Christ-like fashion. They don't check out. They just continue to do what Jesus did day in and day out. Jesus sends these letters via John from the island of Patmos back in the year 94 AD, a long time ago. And yet, as we read them today, and I would encourage you to go read them, to start reading the first 3 chapters or so of Revelation, just read them. And there is a ring of truth to them, that Jesus is still knocking if we are still listening. And we are called to listen, even when the going is rough, especially when the going is rough. For the promise of Jesus will be fulfilled and a new day will dawn. In the end, it will all be made right and good and true. And we'll get there as a church. As a church that doesn't make all the pain go away, but as a church that understands that it's worth it. Thanks be to God. Amen.